Welcome back to the Raw Selection Private Equity Podcast. Joining us today is Christina Haxton, founder and chief executive of Center for Sustainable Strategies. She works with executive teams on the intersection of strategy and leadership. What we're going to dive in today is the balance of the relationship between the private equity firm and the portfolio executive team, and how to support a business as it scales through massive, fast-paced growth, consistently changing and churning, and how to reduce the amount of stress and problems that sit with the team as a result of it. Let's dive in. Christina, if you could share with us a brief insight into you, please.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me. So my focus is on basically following or finding patterns that show up in growth and transition environments, particularly in PE-backed companies. And what I've noticed is, where strategy can be sound, that execution really starts to slow down well before it shows up in numbers. And I've also noticed that there are some friction points when strategy isn't working, and it's not because of lack of effort. There are really kind of four areas that I've noticed, and one area is when decision rights are really unclear. There's weak accountability. There's leadership misalignment. And number one, I also see a lot of is when conversations are not had. So difficult conversations are avoided by the team. So my background is a little unconventional. I was trained in systems and human behavior. And then I moved into executive advisory work, like executive coaching, and then some team coaching, and then transitioned from there into helping teams and companies create a strategy that was executed and owned by all. So I've spent about 20 years working with teams. I've also noticed, that there are common patterns that show up when I first started facilitating strategic planning. I think we can put that in air quotes. Many years ago, I would get called in by the company to come in and do yet another strategic plan. And I noticed that it was like 50 first states every time we started the strategic planning process, because it was like we were here and nothing got executed. So I realized that also what companies needed was not only an executable strategic plan, but the people who were responsible for executing also needed support. So I really work at the intersection of strategy and leadership now.
Marvelous. Well, I think everyone who kind of has a coach stops having a coach, and then after a year realizes that they need a coach again, and they've stopped the accountability, etc. And we've all been through that path many times. So how do you manage the balance between the private equity firm's expectations, or how do you support the executive team in managing the balance between the private equity firm's expectations and then the kind of realistic nature of what's happening in the executive? It's that old conversation between private equity investor style conversations and actually the executive team and what they can see, and both sometimes are very different.
Absolutely. It's like almost speaking two different languages. Like we start speaking the same language and then we start to drift. So you manage that, Alex, or I do, by really treating it as, assuming that we're going to have an alignment and a translation problem, right? Not a problem about, well, they're not bought in, or, they're motivated by something we're not motivated by. People start, the two groups will start telling each other a story about the other, and then we start to split. So when that happens, trust erodes. When that happens, communication gets guarded, and then execution really starts to wobble. So we see, the way the problem shows up when that misalignment begins to happen are, decisions get reopened time and time again. So unclear decision making, or that we end up making the same decision. We find that we're making the same decisions over and over again. Ownership gets fuzzy. Who's owning what? The CEO ends up, a lot of times the CEO is the one who's kind of the translator, right, between the sponsor and the team. That person kind of ends up being the bottleneck oftentimes. I kind of liken it to, some of the early warning signals that that's happening. We have this misalignment is kind of like the low tire warning light. Like I have a car that has a low tire warning light, and honestly, I have thought I should probably get that looked at because I don't know which of the four tires is going to go, but guarantee if I get a flat, it's going to be at a bad time. So we really want to start early with that between the sponsor and the CEO and the team. And we get really concrete on four things. And one thing is goals. The other thing is metrics. The other thing is timeline. And I think one of the most important thing in some some people call it vision. I think vision's great, but also when it comes to goals, we want to get super clear on what does done look like, not only for the sponsor, but also for the team. It's like the cartoon, in cartoon bubbles, you have a cartoon and you have the thought bubble above each person's head. We really want to make sure they don't remain thought bubbles. We want to really make sure that's super clear and co-created between the sponsor and the executive team.
So what conversations are you having with these guys to kind of get, because everyone's got a different perspective. The investors just think you need to do X, Y, and Z, and then it comes out the other end, regardless of the market. The executive team's thinking, why is the investor asking me for all this data, all this information, all this info that we haven't needed before, or depending on where, the exposure and experience of the executive team is with regards to private equity. What's the kind of beginning shape of that? And you said the CEO plays the middle person in all of that.
Well, I think eliminating those two facets and bringing it literally, it's a very co-created and collaborative effort and an inclusive process. So instead of having, somebody talking over here, here's the sponsor who's private equity sponsors, like this is what our expectations are, and they create that in a vacuum. And then you have the CEO and the leadership team creating the strategy in a vacuum. Instead of two vacuums, let's bring everybody together from the beginning and talk about why. Why are we doing this? Why are we partnering? Literally, if I'm assuming this is a relationship that can be described as a partnership. Why are we partnering? Right? What's our why? And what's our end result? Right? And really have these conversations before you even do that. And I think I may have heard this as one of your guests on one of your previous episodes. It was fantastic. I apologize about not remembering the name of the gentleman, but he talked about culture and making sure we have, clarity, alignment. Well, clarity, alignment, action is our framework. So make sure we have clarity about what our why is, why we're doing this, right? Make sure that we have alignment with respect to culture between the private equity firm and the company, because these are for people who are in it for the long haul, right? So I think that's really essential to make sure that we're aligned, not only with respect to culture and values, but also with respect to what are our outcomes, like what's the best possible outcome for both. And then backwards planning that into, and what does that look like? Now, that doesn't mean the sponsor dictates the how. I think the sponsor's responsibility is having clear expectations, but also providing those resources for the company to grow, right? So we're working alongside each other. And the other piece is, I think, frequent communication. And even before all that, we talked a little bit earlier, but even before all that, we have to build trust. We have to have that foundation of trust between the two organizations, or else it's like building a house on sand. You don't want to build a 3-story house on sand quickly or slowly, but that's what's going to happen if we don't start with that foundation of trust, with clarity about what we're doing, why we're doing it, alignment between the two organizations, and alignment with respect to what our goals and metrics and what does done look like, and then action, meaning we know we're taking the right action.
So you mentioned the building of trust and getting alignment there. What do you advise that chief executives do to start to build that trust with private equity when then maybe that's a new relationship or that started to break down?
Be a little bit specific about that, if you could, a little more specific.
Well, let's say we've got new private equity firms just acquired a first-time PE-backed business. They don't, obviously, the executive team, it's a brand new relationship, brand new conversation. You mentioned about the importance of building that trust. What would you advise that the chief exec does with the PE firm to begin to build the trust with his management team, with his senior management team, junior management team, and obviously himself with the PE firm?
Absolutely. I think is post-acquisition. So pre-acquisition and due diligence, that's another ball game. That can be really interesting thing to navigate. But let's post-acquisition. I think one, communication is key, but also bringing people together. I don't know how feasible it is sometimes or how people think it's not feasible to literally bring the sponsor into a meeting with the entire executive team, so that they can understand what we're doing. So we can have conversations. We can have conversations about concerns, ask questions. And I think that's where we start, where, we all come together. I'm not an advocate, especially initially, of having the CEO be the go-between all the time and cutting off the communication. I think having, like, for example, when we do the vision, values, purpose statements and clarity around that, bringing the sponsor into those meetings, ideally, is what I like to see happen, instead of trying to do damage control because there's been a lack of communication, or there's confusion, or there's speculation or gossip, or any of that starts. I like to head things off at the pass as much as possible.
And for the vision, value, purpose statements, again, well overused by lots of different companies and businesses that go on about such scenarios, but realistically, usually sometimes not very good. What's your difficult question probably to answer, but I'll try it anyway. What's your take on how you know if you've got a good vision, how you know if that kind of cornerstone of the bridge, so to speak, is solid? What does it look like when that works?
Some of that, it's what it feels like. I was brought in to work with a company just prior to due diligence, and they had a pretty good strategy, although there were way too many priorities. And they had taken a run at their vision, and it became really clear to me that the CEO's vision was not articulated enough. Well, let me say it differently. The CEO's vision was about, well, I'm going to make it up. Obviously, I don't want to disclose anything specific, but it was like, being they were already at 100 million. I don't know, we'll say being $1 billion company. It had it's the vision was dollars. And when we got to, there were some trust issues, I'll just say. And when we got through the trust issues and we built a foundation of open and honest communication, it was clear that the executive team was not aligned with the vision that the CEO had of being $1 billion company. And he couldn't understand why. And that was pretty clear. He was like scratching his head, like, isn't that exciting? And everybody's like, not really. And not only that, but our direct reports aren't going to find it very exciting either. So we need to come up with something else. So we started brainstorming and storyboarding it and came up with a story that had an emotional component to it that made people's stomach go, ooh. And so, like, it was exciting. It was like, I don't know if we can do that, but we can kind of see it, right? And so when the CEO shifted from this vision of dollars, and you could see it, and I could see it in the team, and I could feel it in the team. They became excited about it. They could state it. They were excited to go back and tell their teams, here's what we're doing. I think they called it something like a moonshot. And the product that they had, that they were a distributor for, it was something to do with the number of miles from the Earth to the moon. I mean, so the numbers were relevant, and they had nothing to do with dollars. I mean, if you look downstream, yes, it did have something to do with the bottom line and the EBITDA, but that wasn't the goal. So it really is when we know the vision is hitting, it's people get a little butterflies in their stomach. That's a good sign. And you could just see it on their faces and they're excited to talk about it. They're not dreading like, oh, how am I gonna communicate this downstream?
It reminds me of feedback I got from one of my mentors, actually, which was centered around we have this goal and we promote this kind of journey to 10 million as our first milestone. And which is interesting because I've given this feedback to people as well. And it's interesting when it comes straight back at your face and you're like, yeah, I've given that out. Nobody cares. Like nobody
Exactly.
talk about the journey,
You're like,
talk
oh,
about what it will make. So we created this whole, and we put it onto our EVP, employee value proposition of what that will be for people and how we'll go on that journey. And even now I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, I probably haven't hammered that home enough. We haven't talked about that enough. We haven't pushed that journey enough. We haven't pulled the narrative. And then you got to be constantly looking at that. So yeah, job of a chief exec is never done. So that's, yeah, really interesting as to I love the story and the narrative around kind of building out and getting alignment and being more than a number, which I think is private equity can be definitely a victim of going, hey, goal is this, EBITDA is this, let's go. And everyone's like, don't care.
it's not compelling. Not compelling. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A quick break from the podcast to introduce Chief Outsiders. Chief Outsiders help private equity firms and their portfolio companies accelerate revenue and increase enterprise value fast. Their bench of seasoned growth executives aren't career consultants. They're strategic operators who've led sales and marketing inside real businesses. They embed directly into portfolio companies to drive growth from insight to strategy to execution. And when deeper capability is needed, their on-demand execution teams jump in to get companies to go to market without the delay or long-term cost of full-time hires. Everything they do is backed by a proven, market-tested methodology and an AI-native operating system built from more than 2,000 engagements, bringing collective experience to every initiative. Chief Outsiders have partnered with hundreds of private equity firms and even more than 500 portfolio companies to drive billions in revenue growth. If you're looking to accelerate value creation across your portfolio, visit chiefoutsiders.com. The Chief Outsiders growth starts here. So looking at different side, so private equity demands speed. Private equity demands, hey, we want to achieve these numbers, these revenues, and hopefully a chief exec is positioning that from a vision perspective differently than just, hey, we want to hit these numbers and guys, I've got a big equity payout when it happens and you guys will, be along for the ride. How do they, especially with private equity backed first founder business, founder-led, founder-owner type businesses, slow typically, how do private equity firms that demand speed, how do they build and how do the executive team build a culture that can move quickly without the old adage of just basically shifting through its people, killing its people because of that constant? And when I say that, for everybody listening, it's not the pace that kills people, not metaphorically, obviously. It's the change and constant change and pointing in different directions, in my opinion, where you go, hey, this is the thing we're doing this week. And now we've done that. Now we want to be doing this thing. And the guy's like, God, I've got 7,000 different jobs all in this period of a year. And that for me is what causes the problem of disengagement and people not believing in the vision. So how are you working with teams to try and navigate that? Because, certainly we've been a victim in the business here of kind of doing that. And you just end up burning through and burning people out, I think is probably the phrase used nowadays, too quickly.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience in helping executives and CEOs and founders of recover from burnout way back when. So it's always less expensive to prevent it, right? We spend more time at work than we do at home. And because we spend so much time at work, I think it's critical that we have as a CEO of a company, the culture is 100% their responsibility. It's their opportunity and it's their responsibility. When you create a culture of whatever you decide you're going to create your culture, because if you don't decide in your culture and do it, your employees will decide it for you. And it's really difficult to recoup that. You want to create a culture where people are, and we use the word engaged, and engagement is by definition, your emotional connection to work. And it's funny because I grew up in a time where when I was working, actually, when I was working I was never worked in corporate, I worked in organizations, but I remember the old adage, kind of being leave your problems, leave your person, your human at the door. From a neurological perspective, that is incredibly impossible. So we can't leave our person, our human at the door. So we can't do that. Then why not make the workplace some place that people love the hell out of what they do, instead of going home and, I don't know if I can say bitching, but you can edit it if you want.
You can say that.
Bitching, moaning, and complaining to the partner about how awful work was and how it sucks and how, et cetera. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we got to come home and talk to whomever we talk to at home, which is, I had a fantastic day today. I was recharged and energized instead of drained and constantly frustrated. So I think, owners, business owners and CEOs have a wonderful opportunity to create that in the workplace, since we spend so much time there. So why not, right? So I get it. Burnout, unfortunately, isn't a one overused term. It's actually a clinical term, but we don't want people even having start to have those symptoms, because it does affect the bottom line. That's proven. So I get that PE demands speed, right? I'm all for speed, but you can't build a 3-story house on sand. And if you try to move fast without that solid foundation, Alex, you don't get speed. What you get is fragility, and fragility is expensive, right? So first of all, what does that look like? Well, speed with fragility looks like everyone's busy, right? I'm busy. That seems to be a badge of honor some people wear. Everything's urgent. The same issues keep resurfacing. Handoffs break. Small problems become dumpster fires. Leaders start to get disengaged, just copying me on everything. And when a manager is disengaged, not even leaders, but when managers are disengaged, that actually is contagious to their direct reports. So and that affects people's engagement, right? Somebody's perception of their manager being burned out actually because emotions are contagious. So it has a direct effect on their direct reports. So all that said, that's anxiety. That's not speed, right? So what creates real speed, to answer your question, is trust. And truth early, transparency, open and honest and constructive conflict, not destructive conflict in the room. When we are facing a difficult situation, let's just say with another person or amongst a team, oftentimes they just naturally avoid, right? That's our go-to move. Under stress, we naturally avoid, or if we don't have the skills to have a difficult conversation, or if the culture says we don't talk about that, right? They'll follow those unspoken rules. So when we have constructive conflict, when we can be open and honest and we work through that conversation, we actually create connection and bonds with other people, just human to human, in person. And when we do that, turns out we make better decisions. We take appropriate risk. We get energized. We get motivated. And we strive harder. Now we have a culture of trust. Yeah. So it happens conversation by conversation. So, that's number one, what we want to do. And I'm going to go back to kind of my framework, which is, clarity, alignment, action. When we have clarity about what we're doing and why, when we have alignment at the top and from the bottom up, and the top down, and then across the organization, we're all rowing in the same direction. We don't feel that friction, that tension. And if we do feel the friction and tension, we have the tools to lean into it, work through it, and then get stronger as a result. And then action. We know what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? So.
So and I find, I'm thinking about my own business and how I'm trying to grow that at this point. And you mentioned about the pushing that EVP and thinking about a lot of this comes down to communication, how we're framing things, how we're positioning things, where, I mean, especially from an executive of, where the focus is coming, where the return on investment, where the wins are coming. So I find that also helps. If anyone's listening to this and thinking, okay, where do I go to try and get more information in regards to this? What would be some of the, I know from our dialogue prior to this, you're a big fan of Scaling Up, I'm a big fan of that book. I think it's phenomenal for the different stages and the cross variance that book has. Were my favorite authors, Patrick Lencioni, and I know obviously you referenced him as well in our email dialogue. Where would you recommend that people go in order to try and get better, improve their executive skills to become a better executive leader and to begin to start to consume more around this?
Well, so I'd like to add I don't know, a resource, and I write a lot about this on our blog, and it's the Center for Sustainable Strategies, all one word, insights. And I love giving practical tools for that people can use right away. CEO could go read it and he could say, "Oh, I can implement that tomorrow," right? So I'm going to give you an example of just two tools, and then I'll mention, a couple of books that if you're looking for those kinds of resources. So one is two quick wins. So a weekly execution friction check-in. I love using this tool. So instead of having just kind of a status update, like a weekly stand-up meeting, goal achieved, yes, no, or goal not achieved, and here's all the excuses why. Let's just not even focus on that. So a real super quick weekly execution friction check-in, like, so if there's friction, so we don't talk about status, we talk about where are you stuck? What have you tried? Is there support that you need around that? And let the other team members, weigh in on that, like being open to suggestions, making sure that every priority has a clear ownership, because sometimes we get that ownership drift. And if you have, excuse the saying, but one throat to choke is always better than more than one, right? You need to have one set of eyes to look into to see who owns this, and make sure that we don't have any bottlenecks. So that's one quick way is to implement that. Another thing I like to suggest is it's called a stop doing rule, and you probably have heard about this, which is first of all, we don't add a priority without agreeing to stop doing something else, right? Otherwise, people get too many things to do. We don't know. And did you know the word priorities is actually not a word? We actually have made that word up because we can't have multiple priorities. That's like jumbo shrimp, right? So priority, getting really clear and focused when people start to drift, what that priority is, and what are we going to stop doing if we do take this on. So those are two quick wins. A lot of other quick wins on the blog, and certainly can sign up for an insights. But every 3 weeks or so, we offer some real challenge and some practical tools for that. With respect to the books, I like the book BE 2.0, Beyond Entrepreneurship.
Okay.
2.0 from a leadership and management standpoint. I think it offers very practical tools and strategies, and also it talks about the leadership component a lot of your management books don't talk about. Yeah. So those are the two that I'd recommend, that and Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I believe there's another one, Alex, what is that? There's kind of a complement to that.
Team player.
No, that wasn't quite it, but it's like the complement to 5 Dysfunctions. It's the opposite of that. Like, 5 things, highly functioning teams do. But I apologize about not knowing that.
Yeah, I've got literally all of his books, and I can't think of titles, but there's a few of them. And in my favorite for me is The Moat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read that, but I think it's also from a private equity lens as well, which makes it ultra more interesting from my perspective. But it's around basically being a good chief exec, and the guy who's in it's not, and thinks he is, and finds out that the person that acquires his business in the end is the right chief exec to acquire it, and he was being pretty rubbish throughout. So, but no, all valuable stuff, and I'm sure it'll come to us after this one. What's the book title is? How does anybody reach out to you, Christina, post this podcast, should they wish to do so, please?
Oh, thanks for asking. I'm happy to help. Email me directly, Christina at sustainable-leaders.com. Certainly go to the website, Center for Sustainable Strategies.com, and also on LinkedIn, Christina Haxton. And so I'd love to connect. Oftentimes I am very visible on LinkedIn also. So lots of tools and strategies and tactics, not only on my personal page, but also welcome to follow our company page, Sustainable Center for Sustainable Strategies. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. And thank you very much for all of our listeners today for tuning in yet again to the Private Equity Podcast. Till the next time, keep smashing it.